Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. We're going to begin today in the North American English colonies. And on that note, there is one thing I'd like to address. I've seen some discussion online and some thoughtful, deeply intellectual YouTube comment sections about the word Americans. About when it's appropriate and accurate to use the word Americans. And I'm here to tell you that it's perfectly okay to call anyone living in the Western Hemisphere, regardless of the year, an American. Amerigo Vespucci lent his name to these continents, to North and South America. The U.S. is the United States of America. We're a part of that larger community. And American has become kind of a shorthand for someone from the U.S., but even in the colonial era, when Massachusetts was still a British property, it's perfectly fine to call the people there Americans. Or the French fur traders operating out of Detroit or Saint Louis, or the Spanish in Peru, they're all Americans. Not only is it technically accurate, it's period accurate as well. You see the term used not frequently, but occasionally in letters and dispatches of the time. Those letters and dispatches often carry kind of a derisive tone, kind of provincials, but they were sometimes called Americans. So to all of our friends in Argentina and Jamaica and Canada and everyone else on this side of the globe, we're all Americans. This is episode 208, Pirate Brokers, Part 1. With all that out of the way, it's time to get down to the good stuff, the kind of swashbuckling stuff for which you come to the Pirate History Podcast. We're talking about 17th century gubernatorial politics in New England. Try to contain your excitement. Growing up, I knew exactly 4 things about New England history: Pilgrims, witches, headless horsemen, and the Boston Tea Party. But naturally, there is a lot more to it. New England was always a headache for the crown. Their governments and governors were always causing problems for the mother country, well before the Revolution. Round about 1692, you would find our old friend Benjamin Fletcher as governor in New York. John Easton was serving in Rhode Island. William Phips, who we know pretty well by now, was in Massachusetts, and then there was William Penn in Pennsylvania. Their primary concern for all of them, even while Phips was dealing with the witch trials in Salem, their primary concern was the war. The 9 Years' War against France, or as they called it, King William's War. And they did so because they didn't want to be fighting this war. They blamed it on King William. It was a burden. They and their people bore a heavier tax burden than they had prior to the war, and it all took a toll on their trade and their manpower. When people are busy fighting, they're not busy tilling the fields or fishing or trading. The only governor, though, that really seemed interested in prosecuting the war was William Phips in Massachusetts. See, his colony had a tangible territorial gain at stake in the fighting. They wanted Maine. Benjamin Fletcher, well, we've talked about him at length. The 2 real sticks in the mud about this whole thing were John Easton in Rhode Island and William Penn in Pennsylvania. Both men were Quakers, both had proto-democratic leanings, and both were pacifists. King William, as you might imagine, hated them. Well, no, I shouldn't say hated. He was really annoyed with them. Both men were elected rather than appointed, first of all, which, kings aren't terribly fond of. Both colonies had their own private, governmental codes, which most kings aren't fond of. More than that, though, most of all, they were counterproductive to the war effort. They weren't paying their extra wartime taxes, nor were they raising levies to fight against the French. It was maddening, and I would Oh, I would love to delve into William Penn and all of his proto-democratic bona fides, and really just how much King William despised all of it. And it's not because William III was some kind of absolutist tyrant. He wasn't. He came from a relatively democratic republic. But he wanted his subjects, his representatives in America, to fight the war. And William Penn, well, he just wouldn't. Now, William Penn kind of owned the territory of Pennsylvania. It had been granted to him by royal writ some years before. It was, I think, the largest non-royal landholding in the world. But despite that, King William recalled him back to England because of his reluctance to engage in warfare. Now that's a fascinating story, and I encourage you to look it up, but it doesn't really impact our story today, except in one thing. King William needed a governor in Pennsylvania who would pay their taxes and prosecute the war. And beyond that, there was a desire to consolidate some of these colonial holdings in America. And, when I say the king wanted these things, I really mean the government of the king, mainly the Privy Council and the Lords of Trade and Plantations. They wanted these things. But it was King William that appointed a new governor to oversee Pennsylvania, our old friend Benjamin Fletcher. He got the colony up and running from the royal perspective. They were doing fine before that. Philadelphia was a boom town that traded in all kinds of luxury goods. The kind of goods that Boston was a bit too puritanical for, and New York was a bit too piratey for. So Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, as an extension, were doing just fine, but Benjamin Fletcher got the colony paying taxes and raising troops. Now, his stint as governor only lasted for a few months. William Penn eventually relented. He agreed to pay his taxes and to send men off to kill other men, and thus he was sent back to Pennsylvania. But that other Quaker governor, John Easton, in Rhode Island, he was more troublesome. He never sent troops anywhere, even when his neighbors were in dire straits, even when they specifically requested he do so, even when it might have saved lives. He never did. This irked the king. Maybe not as much as Pennsylvania. I mean, Rhode Island was small, much smaller than Pennsylvania, but still, it's the principle. So when William Phips, the soon-to-be governor of Massachusetts, went to England in 1691 with Increase Mather to petition the king for a new Massachusetts charter, the king installed him as governor, but he gave him another job. Phips was going to take command of the Rhode Island militia. This gave him royal authority over Governor John Easton in all military affairs. The Rhode Island Council wasn't terribly fond of this, and a flurry of correspondence flew between Providence and London. The council and the governor were all arguing and providing relevant documentation that the king had no right to supersede their authority in this matter. And the king would shoot back with his own arguments, but it was just about at this time that a small group of teenage girls were accusing their friends and neighbors of Congress with the Beast, of witchcraft. We've been talking a lot about print journalism lately as it relates to pirates, but the Salem witch trials were a big part of the rise of print journalism. I mean, pirates make good copy, absolutely. Violence and sin and sex and all that sells well, but the witch trials, complete with their suggestive themes and tales of carnal lusts, well, it sold a lot of papers. Governor Easton wrote to the king in one of his final letters, making his argument, and I'm going to paraphrase a bit here. It was something like, "Bro, see what they're doing over there? That's crazy. They're hanging people. They're putting kids in jail. They can't run our army." More specifically, it read, quote, "The people of this colony Massachusetts, had suffered too much from the superstitions and the priestcraft of the Puritans, readily to adopt their delusions. The bedevilment of their neighbors engrossed their whole attention. End quote. The crux of his argument was basically, they're dealing with their own thing over there. You can't give them control of our forces. So King William eventually relented on that front. But it looks like he took a different tactic. There is some evidence and suggestion that King William, or more likely somebody in his cabinet, was engaging in secret correspondence with the deputy governor of Rhode Island. His name was John Greene, and John Greene was not a Quaker. In fact, a member of the assembly there in Rhode Island called him, quote, a brutish man of very corrupt or no principles in religion, end quote. But there do seem to be two different versions of Deputy Governor Greene. The first is a version that lived in Rhode Island and served its people honorably for 60 years. He was nearing 80 at this point in our story, a man who was a pillar and a servant of the colony his whole adult life. The other version appears somewhat abruptly in 1694. This was a 74-year-old scoundrel who transformed into a troublemaker of the highest order, a disreputable rogue. The shift happened when John Greene began distributing privateering commissions. Now, it's entirely possible he was a disreputable rogue, that he caught wind of some of the massive profits that Benjamin Fletcher was making in New York and wanted in. It's also possible that John Greene did what he thought was right. They were at war with France, and France had a large privateer force that virtually controlled the North Atlantic Ocean. England needed a response. The colonies needed a response. Rhode Island needed one. And Governor Easton, it appeared, was too weak to do what needed to be done. So John Greene stepped up and issued a number of privateering commissions. And it's not like he was alone in doing so. At just about the same moment, we're talking within a couple of months of each other, governors in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York were all arming this armada of private naval contractors. All of those naval contractors were given, quote, a defensive commission against His Majesty's enemies, end quote. There were a few who were given offensive commissions, but we'll talk about them next time. For now, this flurry of privateering commissions might suggest that there was a policy shift toward privateering in the English court. King James II had been adamantly against the notion of arming anyone outside of the Royal Navy. Now, early on, William III did permit the granting of commissions by governors for very specific actions, like the battles of Port Royal or Quebec. But on the whole, the governors did not have carte blanche to grant letters of marque to anyone who wanted one. But right here, in this very short window of time, a bunch of them did so. All of a sudden, it suggests that orders had come down from London giving them that permission. Now, there may be evidence of this that could be very obvious, but I can't find it, and none of the sources from which I'm working mention it. But it makes one think that someone spoke to or wrote to John Greene. If Governor Easton was not going to do the job, it looked like it was time for someone to do so. But beyond potential royal policy, there's a very good chance it may just have been the Thomas II effect. He arrived at New York with this giant pile of silver, and it enriched everyone in the colony. From the governor on down, who's to say that the rest of New England didn't see some of that and wanted in on the next big score? And then maybe it was Henry Every. This deluge of privateering commissions all come in the wake of his mutiny of the Charles II in May 1694. Those couple of months were the summer of 1694. But maybe it wasn't a desire to get in on the action. Maybe That shift in royal policy came down, not against the French, but against the pirates aboard the Fancy, and what they must have feared would have been a wave of pirates following in their example. That summer saw dozens of commissions handed out. Most of them, admittedly, were to ships that stayed in local waters, who actually defended the New England coast, who did their job as privateers, but some of those ships did not. Personally, though, I think it was a more direct influence on the part of Thomas Tew. I would not be surprised in the least to find out that he had agents in Philadelphia and Boston and Providence with big bags of bribes for anyone in the governor's office who could secure a commission. Now, not a commission for himself or the Amity. He had his own commission. It was locked down from Benjamin Fletcher, but he needed commission for all his friends. And Benjamin Fletcher wasn't going to be able to give commissions to all his friends. He had already handed out a few too many to do so. Notably, 2 commissions to men who were not directly associated with Thomas Tew: Richard Glover and John Hoare. And it's worth introducing those 2 captains today. John Hoare was born in Ireland, probably in 1664 or 65. He was an infant when Henry Morgan and the Brethren of the Coast were raiding Portobello and Panama. He was a full generation removed from the Brethren of the Coast. And I bring this up for a couple of reasons. First, I just kind of like to occasionally look at what past and future pirates were up to while our current pirates are active. On that note, here in the summer of 1694, Benjamin Hornigold and Charles Vane and Edward Teach were all 14 years old. Jack Rackham and Black Bart Roberts, they were 12. Mary Read was 11. Sam Bellamy and Stede Bonnet, 6. And Bonnie had yet to be born. There was definitely inspiration taken from generation to generation in the golden age of piracy, but more importantly, the second reason I bring up Henry Morgan is because John Hoare sailed his frigate, the Dublin, to Port Royal, Jamaica. This was prior to the earthquake in 1689 or 1690. He was probably one of the last mariners to receive a letter of marque from Port Royal. It was Governor Beeston, who you may remember, that commissioned John Hoare to attack the French. And that's what he did. John Hoare spent several months countering the machinations of the French privateers around Hispaniola. That's Lauro de Graaf and his group. Then he moved on to the Leeward Islands, and it was there, in a small raid off of Martinique, that John Hoare encountered a man named Abraham Samuel. Abraham Samuel was, he was born the son of a black slave woman and her French master. The French Code Noir was more legally permissive of children of mixed-race couplings than the English, for example, but it still wasn't great. The father had virtually unlimited legal rights to do with the child as he wished, and the chance that the sexual encounter that created Abraham Samuel was anything other than rape is vanishingly small. His father almost certainly treated Abraham like property, not as a son. So when the opportunity arose for Abraham Samuel to run away with a bunch of privateers, he did so. When John Hoare arrived at Martinique, Abraham Samuel made his way to his ship and joined up. After Martinique, though, the West Indies were getting a little too hot for John Hoare, so he sailed up to North America. Plus, he'd likely heard that there were big moves taking place in that theater of the war. It was either during or shortly after the Battle of Port Royal, in Canada, that John Hoare captured a French frigate called St. Paul. And to his credit, John Hoare did what you are supposed to do in that situation as a proper privateer. He sailed the St. Paul back to the English colonies for verification. Now, after this large-scale battle, the Admiralty courts in Boston and New York were backed up. So Captain Hoare sailed for Providence, where the Rhode Island Assembly convened an Admiralty court of their own. They adjudicated Hoare's capture of the St. Paul, and on 7 January 1694, they deemed it a legal, wartime privateer action, and they granted John Hoare ownership of the St. Paul. He renamed her John and Rebecca. Then he sold his old ship, the Dublin, and took up residence in New York. There he married a woman whose name I couldn't track down, but we know about the marriage because of her brother, Richard Glover. Glover was related to judges and colonels and relatively wealthy merchants. Now, we're not talking the super wealthy, not Frederick Phillips and his ilk, but men who did run in the same circles as Frederick Phillips. It's probable, verging on certain, but not confirmed, that the marriage between John Hoare and Richard Glover's sister was arranged to secure some kind of business deal. A behind-the-scenes, back-room kind of business deal, but with a lot of money on the line. See, John Hoare showed up in this shiny new frigate armed to the teeth. He was a successful privateer. Then he married into the family of Richard Glover. That gave him a wife and a house in New York. It made New York his home port for good. And then, shortly thereafter, in the summer of 1694, Benjamin Fletcher granted John Hoare and his brother-in-law Richard Glover privateering commissions. Richard Glover was given command of the 200-ton, 16-gun, 80-man frigate Charming Mary. He was given command by that judge and colonel and merchant to whom he was related that I mentioned earlier. The Charming Mary, under Captain Glover, and the John and Rebecca, under Captain Hoare, were to sail together. They were to sail for Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. But their mission was not connected to that of Thomas Tew, and it was different than that of Thomas Tew. They weren't part of the same fleet at all. Thomas Tew was to be an independent operator. He was to sail east to hunt prizes and return with plunder. Real pirate stuff there, but pirates can be unpredictable. Even though Thomas Tew had a wife and children in New York and a nice new home of his own, Governor Fletcher could never quite guarantee that he was going to return as promised. Captains Glover and Hoare, though, they would do the job. And their job here was not pirate stuff, it was hauling cargo to Madagascar. The two ships had been filled to the bursting with guns and shot and powder and good wine and, more than anything else, cattle. And, yeah, this included cows, but likely it also included pigs. After all, we know that pirates are very fond of their, salted pork. What? Nothing? We don't have anything queued up here? All right. Anyway, their mission was to sail for Madagascar with the said supplies and to sell them to Adam Baldridge. And it was there at his pirate fortress at St. Mary's that they would... Son of a... And then they had a bit of leeway in their mission statement. We're going to get down to what that leeway entailed down the road, I promise you, but at the end of their voyage, they were to return with their two ships full of illegally obtained slaves that could then be sold on the black market in New England. So with their ships and their cargo in hand, Richard Glover and John Hoare and Abraham Samuel all set sail for Bermuda. There they would outfit their ships for a voyage on what was quickly becoming known, even then, as the Pirate Round. Now, initially I had intended to talk about all the privateers that were handed commissions by the New England governors in the summer of 1694. We've met most of the rest already. But this episode did kind of get away from me, and there is quite a bit to talk about each of those pirates and their commissions. So I'd like to end today with a brief glimpse into the future. All of this privateer activity, while it was possibly ordered by or even just condoned by the Crown, well, it was going to blow up in the faces of every governor in New England. In a little over a year, only one of the 4 governors we talked about today will still be in power. All 4 will have been investigated, 2 will have been detained, and 1 of them will have been arrested. The most common accusation, though, that was levied at these governors and their underlings was what the Admiralty Court called pirate brokering. That's to say, knowingly and with malice aforethought, enabling, outfitting, licensing, and doing business with ships and sailors that were, by that point, responsible for the worst outbreak of piracy that the world had ever seen. Today's story is full of uncertainty. I don't like to tell these kind of stories too often. I'm not qualified to make some of the educated guesses that you have to make when telling one of these stories. I do it, as we will see today, but whenever possible, I like to give you both sides of the story. I'd prefer definitive answers to these questions, answered by historians, but we don't always have that luxury, so here we are, with uncertainty. The second reason I don't like to tell these stories all that often is because there's often little actual story to tell. We have a few scraps of questionable information here and there, and if we were to craft a narrative, we'd have to fill in a lot of the blanks. Now, when a story with this little information is out there, we can usually just hit the bullet points, right? Pirate X sailed to Island Y and captured Z number of small merchant craft. Easy peasy. But here, today, there is an important story to tell. A story that's worth more than just the bullet points. But still, it's a story with shaky facts and little hard information. The difference, though, in today's story is that the information is not shaky because no one kept a journal and they were on some lonesome island or ship in the middle of the ocean. No, there's so little information today by design. The facts are so shaky because the people in this story wanted them to be. The questions and uncertainties are baked into this story because the people that were involved wanted them to be. And those people, the kind of people in question here, well, things almost always worked out how they wanted them to be. This is episode 209, Pirate Brokers, Part 2. Let's begin today with the pirate ship Bachelor's Delight. She's that Dutch slave vessel captured off the coast of Africa way back in 1683, captured by John Cook and Edward Davis, the same ship that carried William Dampier and sailed alongside the Signet on the Second Pacific Adventure. You remember this ship. In 1688, Bachelor's Delight sailed into Philadelphia, where much of the crew went their separate ways. Captain Edward Davis left the ship and traveled to Jamestown in Virginia. That's when George Rayner took command of the ship. Now, some time ago I told you that George Rayner sailed Bachelor's Delight to Madagascar, and he did. They captured some shipping along the way and put in at St. Augustine Bay, at the southwest of Madagascar. But there things start to get tricky for Bachelor's Delight, some of those uncertainties. We know that some of the pirates, at least, from the Bachelor's Delight stayed at Madagascar, but a few months after they arrived, another ship, named either the Royal Jamaica or the Loyal Jamaica, arrived at Charlestown in Carolina. And the commander of the Royal or Loyal Jamaica was George Rayner. Now, there are those who have postulated that this ship was just Bachelor's Delight renamed, trying to hide her piratical past, and that's possible, but I don't think that's what happened here. See, there are conflicting reports of another ship at St. Augustine Bay. She was in poor repair, but still afloat. And some think, and I happen to agree with this point of view, that that was Bachelor's Delight. The problem is that Signet is also somewhere in this mix. When Signet and Bachelor's Delight parted ways on the western coast of Mexico, Cygnet headed across the Pacific Ocean, made her way through the Philippines, around India, and all the way to Madagascar, where she met up with her old friend Bachelor's Delight. Now, I have said before that the ship at anchor there at St. Augustine Bay may have been the Cygnet, and that's possible. But I no longer think that's the case. There are several reports of the Cygnet at some of the ports she stopped at prior to Madagascar, and they all comment on what poor shape she's in. I suspect that they scuttled Cygnet there at St. Augustine Bay. They would have, if that were the case, salvaged her guns and tackle and disassembled the ship for use in constructing their shelters and maybe some docks. But there was another pirate there at St. Augustine Bay, a pirate who had been present on both Pacific adventures named James Kelly. When George Rayner took command of Bachelor's Delight, John Kelly was elected quartermaster. And several years down the road, James Kelly was going to be associated with a ship called Bachelor's Delight. There's some question as to whether it is the same vessel or not, so one of two things happened. Either George Rayner renamed Bachelor's Delight to Loyal Jamaica, and James Kelly captured a new ship and renamed her Bachelor's Delight, or George Rayner just got a new ship called Loyal Jamaica. Occam's razor might suggest that that is the more likely possibility. Regardless, we know that the Cygnet pirates and many, if not most, of the Bachelor's Delight pirates were there at St. Augustine Bay. They set up a little pirate harbor with supplies and women and men who were available for whatever pirate cruises might happen by. Pirates who would sign up and embark on the voyage, do the job, take their cut, and then return to St. Augustine Bay, where they would spend all of their winnings on women and rum and gambling. Now, in the past, I've called these pirates the Cygnet pirates, and that is probably how they started, all men from the Cygnet, but as time went on, that was less and less accurate. Pirates would come and go. Some would make enough money to return home. Some would die, and some would see the tropical paradise there on Madagascar and decide to stay. By about the current point in our story, 1694, most of the pirates from the Pacific Adventure might not have been there at all. Really, we can only confirm that James Kelly and one or two others were still around. And Kelly, well, he wasn't going to be around much longer. In the meantime, though, George Rayner made a life for himself in Carolina. There was some accusation when he arrived that he'd captured a ship belonging to a local planter, but those accusations were brushed aside. George Rayner gave his guns to the colony at Carolina, who were added to the fort at Charleston. Then he paid some of the fees that were due to local officials, and George Rayner was suddenly a welcome member of the community. He bought a bit of land, he got married, and had a mess of kids. Now, there is one report that a George Rayner signed up with Thomas Tew in 1694. But I find that suspicious. George Rayner in Carolina, we know and can confirm, had made some pretty profitable land acquisitions. Later, he would marry some of his children into very prominent families in the region. Now, midlife crises are real, and George Rayner may have been going through that when he decided to sign up with Thomas Tew. Maybe he, wanted a taste of the old adventure, but I don't think that's what happened. It's probably a different pirate, either another man named George Rayner or a pirate named Josiah Rayner, who got confused with the former captain of Bachelor's Delight. But it does appear that George Rayner was, in some way, connected to Thomas Tew and his upcoming voyage. It's possible there's some evidence that he may have invested in the voyage. See, many of those who were involved in the early stages of this upcoming voyage, some of those who invested, for example, they all downplayed their role in the preparations. There were merchants and shipwrights and some prominent landowners and politicians, but nobody after the fact, nobody knew nothing. A little over a year later, when the news starts to filter back to the colonies, I picture, well, if I'm being honest, I picture that scene from The Devil's Advocate in which Keanu Reeves happens upon a late-night shredding party, but we'd do better to picture men in cotton stockings, not silk, but cotton. They're wearing buckled shoes and a poofy-armed shirt. No jacket and no wig. It is nighttime after all, maybe wearing a vest. But picture a man in that state standing before his fireplace, maybe in his study, burning papers in his well-upholstered study. That's an image that, throughout today's episode, I can't get out of my head, and it's one that I'd like you to hold on to as well. Those men, cotton stockings, poofy shirts, later on maybe a snifter of rum and a pipe, or more likely a cigar. I'd like you to picture those men, because those are the very same who we are concerned with today, those who always got what they wanted. Take, for example, Governor Benjamin Fletcher of New York. Last time we talked about some of the questionable privateering commissions he handed out to what were relatively respectable privateers. Namely, we introduced John Hoare and Richard Glover, and a young man from Martinique named Abraham Samuel. Now, those are all names we should remember moving forward, but they aren't the stars of the show. The most famous and controversial person that Fletcher would hand a commission to was Thomas Tew. And Fletcher wasn't a fool here. He knew that Thomas Tew was a pirate and he was sending him on pirate business. So, to protect himself, at least a little bit, Governor Fletcher couldn't go out handing commissions to every scallywag who wanted to sail with Thomas Tew. It would be too obvious, too big. If things turned sour, there would be too many potential charges against him. Now, that was a smart move on Fletcher's part. I mean, things did eventually turn sour. And we can be sure that he was one of those men in cotton stockings, burning papers in his study. A letter from the Lords of Trade, dated 19 October, 1698, reads, quote, "We have information that Tew, in 1694, offered Governor Easton, of Rhode Island, £500 for a commission, which was refused, though it is certain that others there have been guilty of that fault. The fact that Tew's commission from Governor Fletcher is dated in November 1694 makes it highly probable that it was not obtained for nothing." End quote. They're saying that they have no proof that Thomas Tew bribed Governor Fletcher, but that's almost certainly what happened. But it's those others that were certainly guilty of fault that I want to talk about today. Thomas Tew's friends, with Governor Fletcher out of the mix, had to cast a wider net to get their own commissions. And I want to begin with Thomas Tew's quartermaster, Richard Want. And you may occasionally see Richard Want called William Want, especially in some of the older sources, but his name was probably Richard. At least, that's the name that history has landed upon. Kind of like Henry Every goes by Long Ben or Jack Avery, pirates were known to use aliases. Fun, but it makes them hard to track down. Richard Want, though, was a long-time buccaneer. He sailed under Edward Davis and George Rayner on the Pacific adventures, both of them probably. Then he sailed under George Rayner to Madagascar, and eventually back to America on loyal Jamaica. Finally, he met up with Thomas Tew in Rhode Island and signed up as his quartermaster on the first voyage of the Amity. Following their return to America, Richard Want purchased, or maybe otherwise obtained, his own vessel. The Dolphin was a 6-gun, 60-man brigantine. Maybe not the most impressive ship, but it was his. Richard Want was a captain. He outfitted the Dolphin in Philadelphia, and there's some debate over whether or not he obtained his privateering commission from an agent of William Penn. I tend to lean toward the belief that he did, but we can't be sure. See, technically, William Penn wasn't the governor. He was the proprietor of Pennsylvania. He owned the colony. He was a pacifist, but after that brief visit with King William III we talked about last time, he was more willing to hand out commissions. Regardless, Richard Want, captain of the Dolphin, did receive a commission, probably in Philadelphia. He and now his former captain Thomas Tew both had licenses. Richard Want's next order of business was getting the word out about the upcoming voyage, and to do so he sailed for Newport, Rhode Island. There were a ton of pirates in Newport circa 1693 to 94. The first stop that Captain Want was likely to make would be Captain Thomas Wake. At least, Captain Wake, captain of the 100-ton, 10-gun, 70-man bark Susanna, was the first of the Rhode Island men to get his commission. In his book Honor Among Thieves, Jan Rogozinski writes, quote, "The governor of Rhode Island later denied granting commissions. This was technically true, but fundamentally dishonest. The commissions instead had been granted by the governor's deputy, Jack Green. Rhode Island's governor did not personally sign such documents, as Quakers publicly opposed acts of war." End quote. We talked about that last time. Now, that may be exactly how things went down, or maybe not. It's possible that John Green was acting on his own volition here, against the wishes of Governor Easton. It's difficult to tell, especially because the Quakers in the Rhode Island Assembly really closed ranks around their governor when accusations started flying a few years later. We can imagine they had their own burning session. Regardless, it was John Green that issued Thomas Wake his commission. Now, a few weeks ago, we talked about a group of pirates sitting around a campfire on a Rhode Island beach enjoying bad wine and good company. I told you that was possibly where they first heard the pirate verses, allegedly by Henry Every. Now, that part of the story was mostly fantasy. We don't know when or if they heard the pirate verses. But at the end of that story, I mentioned Thomas Wake appearing on the beach, recruiting. Now, I also made a mistake there. I told you that was Thomas Tew's quartermaster. That was, of course, Richard Want. But Thomas Wake was there in Rhode Island recruiting men for the mission. He was almost certainly the pirate that brought word to Joseph Banks and Joseph Farrow, respectively the captain and quartermaster of the 90-ton, 6-gun Portsmouth Adventure. Soon enough, Banks and Farrow had their own commission from Deputy Governor Green, but Joseph Banks wasn't going to stick around. Soon after getting their commission, Joseph Banks left the crew and handed his letter of marque over to the now Captain Farrow. And that raises a question for me. There's this narrative that pops up in the wake of the voyage to come. It's parroted by the Lords of Trade and every one of the governors involved and the rest of the high society folks who were accused of some sort of impropriety. The narrative goes something like this. When word of Thomas Tew's upcoming voyage was announced, it spread like wildfire all across the New England colonies. Thanks to the rumors, New England saw, and this is a quote, servants from most places of the country running from their masters, sons from their parents. End quote. They were all running off to join the pirates. And as it happens, I believe that part, but, well, I'll let Captain Charles Johnson give the account from A General History of the Pirates, Volume 2. It reads, quote, "Captain Tew lived unquestioned in America and had an easy fortune, and designed to live quietly at home. But those of his men who lived near him, having squandered their shares, were continually soliciting him to take another trip. He withstood their request a considerable time, but they having got together a number of resolute fellows, They, in a body, begged him to lead them but for one voyage. They were so earnest in their desire that he could not refuse complying. They prepared a small sloop and made the best of their way to the Straits, entering the Red Sea, where they met with and attacked a ship belonging to the Great Mogul. End quote. Bit of a spoiler there at the end, but that passage tells us that Thomas too wanted to stay in America, but his men begged him to go. It's something that we hear over and over and over again. I mean, in the Buccaneers of America, it told us that Henry Morgan just wanted to stay on Jamaica, but his filthy, dirty, low-born men gambled away all of their winnings, that which they didn't spend on women, and demanded he take them on another voyage. Still, we hear it about all of the ships that are about to set sail from a number of different sources. Now, it's the kind of thing that I would oftentimes disregard completely, but it is odd that Joseph Banks chose to leave his vessel after getting his commission, but before setting out. Maybe he realized that they were not going to sail for Canada and raid the French there, that they were going to sail east and engage in some piracy. That departure, for me, is a strong argument in favor of the "a bunch of poor sailors really were behind it all" storyline. But on the other hand, the flip side of the equation is all of the other evidence and all of the testimony that is to come. That all of these rich, powerful, influential men from New England to London that funded and outfitted their ships specifically to sail for Madagascar, that all of these preparations began immediately after Thomas Tew returned from his first voyage of piracy in the Red Sea. All of these rich, influential men who, never thought that these privateers would turn to rogueries, Your Honor. We only wanted them to engage in honest trade, maybe privateering against the hated French. Honest, legitimate, God-fearing actions. And then, of course, there's Adam Baldridge, who they also didn't know was deep in skullduggerous waters. It really stretches credulity after a while. I don't like to make allusions to modern politics, and I'm not going to do so here, but we all know, no matter where you happen to be from, of at least a dozen different times, at least, that all of our governments have just brushed whatever uncomfortable information they want to hide right under the rug. And we all of us know that they're lying about it, right through their teeth they're lying, but nothing changes. Their friends are protected. No one faces the consequences of their actions. No matter how guilty these rich, powerful, and influential men happen to be, well, they're never found guilty, right? We all live in that world, and I think we're all aware of it, and the pirates lived in a world that was very much the same. I mean, maybe those poor sailors really were behind it all. Maybe Thomas Tew did want to stay in America, but at a certain point you've got to wonder, can you blame him? So, at this point, we've got commissions for Thomas Tew and Richard Want, Thomas Wake, and Joseph Farrow. That's 4 of the pirates who are going to go on this voyage down. The final privateer is a man that we've met before, William May. We should all remember William May. He was a member of William Kidd's privateer crew back in 1690, the crew that mutinied against Captain Kidd and took his ship, the Blessed William. William May was part of the crew that, alongside Samuel Burgess and Edward Coates and Robert Culliford, sailed the pirate round. They were ashore in India in 1692 when they were attacked by Mughal soldiers. They had to leave Robert Culliford behind in a Mughal jail, and eventually William May returned home aboard the Pearl, a brigantine of 200 tons, 16 guns, and 100 men. William May is going to be really the entire crew of the Pearl, and all of those former associates. They're all going to be very important moving forward. In the voyage to come, certainly, but even more so once Captain Kidd throws his hat into the ring. For now, though, William May needed a commission, but exactly how that happened is even more difficult to pin down than the others. Some sources say that he picked up yet another license from Deputy Governor Greene, but there are others that suggest he sailed over to Boston to get his commission from William Phipps. It's hard to say. I think I've made it clear by this point that once those accusations from the Admiralty and the Lords of Trade started filtering back, accusations of what they called pirate brokering, once they started getting tossed around, the truth gets really hard to pin down here. It's not impossible to think that some of these guys might not have had commissions at all. Just, I've got a commission from, what's his name? You know, the guy with the witches, Phipps, that's it. Regardless, William May claims to have had one, which gives us 5 ships. There was William May of the Pearl, Thomas Wake of the Susanna, Joseph Farrow of the Portsmouth Adventure, Richard Wundt of the Dolphin, and finally, Thomas Tew of the Amity. And then, far from New England, but who will eventually be a member of this fleet, Captain Henry Every of Fancy. But here I'd like to introduce a few other mariners that were along for the ride. First, there are 2 pirates I want to mention who were aboard Amity. According to his own testimony, there was a Mr. John Ireland who was hired to serve as navigator. Mr. Ireland tells us, or really told a grand jury, but he said that he was hired under the understanding that they were going to sail for Canada, specifically for the Bay of St. Lawrence, where they would attack the French. I mean, obviously. Bay of St. Lawrence is why you sign up with Thomas Tew, famous Red Sea pirate, a man who was personal friends with the governor of New York and had been declaring for months now his intention to sail back to the Gate of Tears. You know, you sign up with a guy like that to sail for Canada. For, I don't know, cod. Yep, that's real believable. Sure thing. But John Ireland, in that testimony, would tell the court, quote, "The company of the sloop, or the greater part of them, rose up against the captain," by which he means Thomas Tew, "and told him they came out for money, and money they would have before they went home again." End quote. Now, I don't want to give away the game here, but John Ireland, after he signed up aboard Amity and before he gave that testimony, was one of the most wanted men in the entire world. There was a laundry list of charges against him, and many famous names and famous stories that we will talk about involved him specifically. I will also note that nobody, at the time, and few historians now, believe that story. Still, that's what he had to say. I'd also like to mention a Mr. Richard Bobbington, who was probably serving as a bosun aboard Amity. Later on, Mr. Bobbington will become much more relevant to our story. I just want you to know he's aboard. Then, there is Tempest Rogers, who may have the coolest damn name in the history of piracy. Blackbeard, Tempest Rogers, at your service. Tempest Rogers sailed under Captain Thomas Wake, but for now he's a minor player. These 5 ships, once they all allegedly had their commissions, well, it's hard to say what kind of a relationship they all had. You know, were they a cohesive fleet? Did they all sign up under Thomas Tew as their pirate admiral? This is a strange time for the pirates. These were not the Brethren of the Coast. They aren't all going to fall in line behind someone like Henry Morgan. All we can say for certain is that this fleet did have a common destination and a common purpose. Their purpose was plunder. To find, capture, and loot the biggest and richest Moorish ship on the high seas. And this time, it was these men that were going to get exactly what they wanted. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, everybody who has signed up to be a patron on Patreon, everybody who has left us ratings and reviews, and everybody who has recommended this show. You all make it possible. Thank you. I do have a couple of show notes this week. As many of you noted, we were having some trouble with the website that took some time to iron out. However, finally, the website is redesigned and back up. Our entire catalog of episodes is up there, and all of them have a downloadable version available, something that many of you have been asking for some time. You can also make comments on the episodes, which I will read, or you can get in touch with me at the episode. Also, the Treasure Island audiobook and future projects will be found there in short order. You may also notice at the website that there have been some changes made to the episode numbering. While I was designing the episode, I may have gone a little George Lucas and decided to touch up the feed a bit. None of the content is missing, it's all still there, but I did condense a number of episodes. Whenever I went on what feels now like a particularly self-indulgent series of episodes, say the Glorious Revolution or King Louis XIV, I combined them into one long episode. It's still there for you to listen to, but it's also easier to skip for those who don't care to. The change in episode numbering has not yet been implemented on the RSS feed, but it will be showing up in the near future. So in the next few weeks, when you see an episode pop up that seems like it's out of order, don't worry. It's the right episode, just with a new number. This is something that I've been wanting to do, but it now felt like the time to get it out of the way. Because from this point on, there's really not going to be much of a pause in the story of pirates and piracy. It's only going to get faster, bigger, and more dangerous. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our new and improved website, piratehistorypodcast.com. As always, and most importantly, thank you for listening.